Hi everyone, welcome to the webinar today. Thanks so much for joining us. Today, as you can see on the screen, we're going to look at security and how that applies inside Geocortex software. My name is Ryan Cooney. I am what's called a product owner in our world. So what my responsibility is to look after the Geocortex Essentials product and bring it to release and things like that. And a big part of my job over the last couple of years has been a focus on security and how our applications secure themselves, how we connect to secured content, basically just how identities and security works throughout our whole ecosystem, and help you build a GIS application that can bring rich content and apply fine-grained permissions and things like that. So what we're going to talk about today, just how Geocortex software can leverage identities and user credentials and things like that you've got available in your application. So as I was saying, there's sort of two areas here that we're going to cover. So identity being how a user authenticates to the system, how we learn information about that user. So that's sort of the first aspect of everything that we're going to talk about with security, is how do we acquire a user's identity? And then the second side of this is how do we apply that user's identity? So looking at permissions. So what can an individual do inside of an application? What are we going to allow them to do once they're signed in? And we're going to take this a little further. So when we look into identity itself, there's a couple of areas. So where do the identities come from? So what we're going to find is that there are all sorts of sources for where your identity can come from. And we can think of Active Directory as probably the most common example that people encounter, but there's lots of different places where we can get an identity from, and lots of different flavors of how we can get the same sort of identity. We're also going to look at what different ways of getting an identity can offer us. Sometimes an identity is going to come with extra privileges, permissions, content, that sort of thing. So depending on what we choose, how we choose to identify our users, we can also gain extra capabilities. Or restrict ourselves depending on what's been selected. On the permission side, we're going to look at how permissions are applied in the software. So now that we've got an identity, what is the way that we say that a particular user can access something? And we're also going to look at the individual components that can be controlled through permissions once we've got a user's identity available. So we've got a lot of fine-grained control in our software. And I'm going to take you through what those various things are. We won't cover everything, but I will give you the high level, broad strokes overview of what types of things can be secured on a per user basis or per role. Okay, so starting with identity, I mean, there's a lot to this topic, and it's funny, I often get asked, because I've been involved in security in our software for so long, that, oh, can you just give me a recommendation on what the ideal security setup is? And there isn't really a one-size-fits-all answer. And what I've found over the years is that to be able to answer this, you really need to ask a whole bunch of questions first. So these are questions that I would like you to ask of yourselves and your organizations as you're contemplating what security permission model might make sense for you. And they sort of come down to these. But the high level is, who are your users? But this breaks into a few categories of, are your users anonymous or authenticated, or both? That's kind of your key first one. Presumably you're here because you've got some need for authenticated users, but do you need to also offer anonymous access to the same application at the same time? Questions like that can sort of change your thinking a little bit about what we need to do. Also, are your users internal or external? Are they inside your organization, running inside the intranet? Is it an internal user accessing the app over the internet? Or is it just, we've got users from other organizations that we need to grant access to your organizational content, things like that. So internal, external is very important. This one is often forgotten, but who is the user authority? And authority is a term that's kind of tossed around in security context, but where do these users really live? A lot of us vast majority of our customers and deployments that we see, Active Directory is the ultimate authority. And that's actually a really good thing, that what you want is your users to be stored in an application that is solely responsible for user management. What we want to avoid is having a GIS application that owns the users. Occasionally that's the right approach, but generally speaking, let's allow a user management application to manage the users, and let's have a GIS web application just consume those users from that other authority. So in a lot of cases, it's going to be Active Directory, but it could be something like Okta or Auth0 or many of these other identity applications that are possible. So for your organization, where do your users ultimately live? Also, who is the keeper of those users is often interesting. A lot of people that we work with are, their job title might be somewhere in the GIS administrator realm, something like that, and often they're not the keepers of Active Directory. So that's it. That can be an interesting facet of how security is applied when it comes to, are we securing by roles, and do we have the ability to create roles at the GIS application level, or is that something that the IT department of my organization might need to manage? So knowing where your users come from is really critical. And also something that we're trying to push a little bit more is getting people to think more about what other things your organization is doing that are extremely similar to what your GIS web applications might be doing. So if you're looking at Geocortex software, you're probably looking to provide GIS applications on the web to a group of end users, and that's what our software does. And we want to bring authentication to it and security. So, okay, let's get some users in there, but you might look at other things in your organization that, not GIS related at all, but they've got a similar problem. It's a web application of sorts that somehow needs to authenticate users. And the example that I often point to is something like Office 365. So that's, our office uses that. And there's a certain way that authentication happens with something like Office 365 or some other internal application. Can we align what some of these other enterprise systems are doing? Can we align them with what your GIS web applications are doing in Geocortex software? Can we get them to play by the same rules and behave the same way? And that's going to have some tremendous advantages. So thinking about where else is identity being used in your organization in a web application scenario. The other thing that's critical to think about is, what is your organizational strategy towards ArcGIS Online or Portal for ArcGIS? We encounter customers at all ends of the spectrum, people that are fully adopted, they don't have any ArcGIS servers, that all they're using is ArcGIS Online or Portal, to people that are using ArcGIS server exclusively and they're not going to Portal. It's knowing where you lie on that spectrum and knowing where you're going to lie 5 years from now. I think that's really important. And ArcGIS Online and Portal is just becoming so much more popular, and it's just becoming a standard part of the story that we see with WebGIS. It's got a lot of momentum. So if you're not adopted yet, that's fine. There's lots of solutions, but knowing where your organization is trending over the next several years is important, because ArcGIS Online Portal, they offer authentication services and things like that. And there's a lot that they can bring to the table. So just knowing where you're going with that is important. So that's what identity is sort of going to do for us. So where do we get an identity from? And in particular with Geocortex software, what types of identities are supported? So I've listed a bunch here. Active Directory is by far the most common that we encounter. And usually we see this realized through something called integrated Windows authentication. So that's having your web server just automatically use your Windows credentials and sign you in. It's quite transparent. It works quite well. So that is one system that where you're automatically using your enterprise credentials. So that's usually a good thing. That's what we want. There is a flavor of Active Directory, sort of, called Active Directory Federation Services, so ADFS. And it does a number of things, but one thing that it's really good at is allowing, basically it is a web application on its own, but it can sign you into one or more Active Directories. So for really large organizations that have many different Active Directories, this is often sort of the avenue that we go. So we'll authenticate with the ADFS instance. That will figure out which actual Active Directory to sign you in to, and then all that information flows back to the web application, your Geocortex Essentials app. ArcGIS Online and Portal for ArcGIS, they're separate, but they behave the same way. They have user and role management built into them. They also support enterprise sign-in, so you can link your ArcGIS Online or Portal organization to something like ADFS, and now you can get your sort of the best of both worlds. You can sign into an ArcGIS Online instance, but it's also been signed in using your enterprise credentials. So those are identity providers that we can pull into our software. There's also one here called Geocortex Identity Server. Now this is something that ships with Geocortex Essentials, and its purpose is mainly for providing scenarios where you've got some of your users are in the enterprise, but you also need to create accounts sort of more on an ad hoc basis. Often we see this for organizations that have contractors that come in temporarily. They need access to the secure applications, but we're unable to create Active Directory accounts for them, things like that. Or ArcGIS named users, you're not going to pay for some outside contractor to have an ArcGIS account necessarily. So there's a number of scenarios where your main track of users all using Active Directory or ArcGIS identities, but you need another user base that has to be authenticated, but you just need to cook up a quick username and password for them. So that's Identity Server's role, or its main role. It also serves as a way to sort of delegate to other providers. We use it as part of the mechanism for hooking up ADFS and federated with a couple of other security providers. So it plays an important role. Also, we're seeing more and more social media style logins coming. So this is something that we can't support. It's not, your typical app doesn't have it, but it's a player in the area of identity. So these are becoming more and more prevalent. And actually, the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, through their authentication means, they've really changed how applications like ours, how we do security, getting out of sort of siloed, this is my one application that has security completely built into it all on its own, and turning more into this federating or using an external identity provider to establish the identity. There's also a custom option. So implementing custom solutions for your identity provider is definitely possible. The software, Geocortex Essentials, is fully extensible, so you can definitely build numerous different identity providers. But one thing that we want to keep in mind is that even if we're doing something custom, we don't want to build a complete custom solution. What we want that custom piece to do is just interface out with Okta or whatever your identity provider solution is. So some enterprise class identity solution, that's what we want to link to. And just to show this a little bit graphically, we've got sort of a traditional old school approach to security where you've got your users and they're going to authenticate directly with an application, and all the security concerns are owned by that application. And we're trying to shift it more to a model where your users, oh, I've lost my image. There's a little picture of a server supposed to be right there. Your users are connecting to the server, but the server isn't responsible for security. It's just sending you over to the actual security interface. And so the user goes and authenticates with that external service, and then the server and the identity provider can communicate and establish trust. There it is. It's on a delay. Okay. Now taking that generic concept and applying that specifically to ArcGIS, I mean, it's just swapping out that that part of the diagram that had the lock for the entire ArcGIS ecosystem. So it works the exact same way. It's just you get a lot more with an ArcGIS identity. It comes along with services and premium content and all this extra stuff. So it fits the model perfectly, and it brings you more. And to extend on that one little bit further, what's the most common scenario is using ArcGIS with an enterprise login. So you try and access the GIS application, it sends you over to ArcGIS to sign in. ArcGIS actually sends you over to your own Active Directory to sign in, and there's a number of hops, but ArcGIS is able to trust you, we're able to trust ArcGIS, and now the WebGIS application knows your identity, it has access to your ArcGIS content, and now we've got a really rich experience, and we've been able to take advantage of that user authority that is your enterprise users. This is what we want to use. And the beauty of this is if you could swap out all of these boxes here for something like Office 365, it's kind of going to work the same way, that it's authenticating with the exact same mechanism. So we've got a truly enterprise approach to signing in. It's just we happen to go through a hop of ArcGIS Online or Portal. So we can use the enterprise sign-ins, get everything that ArcGIS Online and Portal has to offer, and bring that into the GIS application that we're trying to use. So ArcGIS, I mean, it does offer us a number of things. So, and it's really the pattern with the most momentum, I would say, that we're seeing in deployments of our software, and just in general in the GIS space. That if you're signing in with an ArcGIS identity, we get your identity, we know who you are, what roles, groups you belong to, but you also get access to all kinds of content that can be secured per individual, per role. There's also a number of services, so you can think of map services, but there's also premium services, demographics. There are endpoints that are available, or operations that we can execute in ArcGIS Online and Portal that can do things for us. So there's lots of services that become available to the application. Both Portal and ArcGIS Online basically work the exact same way in this regard. They offer some extremely similar services, even though they're kind of technically separate things. Okay, I'm going to flip into a demo. We're going to look a little bit at authentication, but then flip things over to how permissions are applied. Okay, so where I'm going to start is just in our management application. And the first thing we're going to notice here is I'm being challenged for a login. So we're actually in our management application, we are using the exact same security models that we're using for our end users. So in this case, I'm being challenged to sign into ArcGIS Online. I'm going to use my enterprise credentials. So it's just going to jump through a hop, and now I'm in the application. And if you've never seen Essentials before, basically we're managing a series of GIS applications that we're going to offer to our end users. So I've got this one LA County application. It's got a map, all kinds of layers, tools, functions, that sort of stuff. So this application, I'm just going to quickly open up the user interface for it that an end user will see. So again, I've got my management side of things, and then what the end user sees over here. And you can see that I haven't signed in or anything. It's got a sign in button. So sign in is optional in the software. And if I click sign in, right now it's giving me a choice of different providers that I can sign in. So let's take a look at where those come from. In the management application, there's a security tab here, and there's actually a list of security providers. And you can see that ArcGIS Online and Active Directory are enabled. Identity server is turned off at the moment because I don't need it. But this is an extensible list. We can add many providers. We can add multiple different portals that are available. And if you offer more than one, then the user is going to get a choice. If you've only got one, it just hops right through, and the user doesn't actually see any doesn't see a prompt here. I'm going to pick ArcGIS Online, and you can see I get that same credential challenge where I can just use my my enterprise credentials. So I'm not entering username and passwords, and this is, this sort of a single sign-on experience here that I don't have to type in username and password. So it's one of the goals that people often are looking for. Okay, so I'm now signed in, and there's a number of things that become possible. Sorry, I should have shown this when we were unauthenticated, but there are tools and functions that are just sort of inherently require an identity. So to save files to the server, you don't always want to allow anonymous access to that. So saving content is sort of bound to your identity. So there's tools that turn on here. There's also things like real-time collaboration in the application that becomes available. So a number of things just turn themselves on when you have an identity. But there's loads of other things that we're going to want to take control of. And we'll just go through a few scenarios here of what we might want to, as an administrator, control for different users. So for this particular application, we might want to look at securing the site itself. So the site is sort of our top level. It represents the whole application. And this permissions panel here is basically listing all of the securable entities in the site. So we've got the site contains a map with all kinds of layers. We've also got things like print templates and workflows. So what I could do here is I could just deny anonymous access to the entire site. And I could allow for one of these other roles, I could allow access to that site. I'm just going to pick the global all users. That basically means authenticated users, so someone who's signed in. So if I've denied anonymous, allowed authenticated, let's say if I just refresh this page, now it's forcing me to sign in. So there weren't any choices. You have to sign in at this point. So I can sign in with ArcGIS on. And then I get access to the application. So it's really easy to just blanket secure an application. Making things a little more interesting, let's just clear those permissions here for a second. We can do some simple things like having scenarios where anonymous access is allowed, but anonymous users just shouldn't see certain things. So let's take the crime layer and deny that for the anonymous user. And let's maybe take something else like our print templates here. Let's only allow them the most basic print template, an 8.5 by 11. Apply those changes, save the site. And actually, if I sign out, it's just going to reload the application, but we'll see that I'll be allowed to be anonymous here. So I'm not currently signed in. It's asking me to sign in. And we could look at a few things here. So if I open the print, it's only giving me one of the 3 print templates. And if I go to the layer list, the crime layer disappeared. If I sign in, the crime layer will show up. So there's crime. You have to zoom for it to actually show on the map. But yeah, so there's the crime. So different levels of access can do different things. Okay, and that's securing simple things like print templates and entire layers. We can also secure things like specific tools. So tools are often offered through workflows in Essential software. So we've got all of these business-specific capabilities. In this case, the demographics query is a particular custom tool that's offered. So we can secure those. So we can totally change what tools are available to the end user. We can also take, layers are one of the areas that's really interesting, where we've got a ton of power. And we can take layers and secure them in a number of different ways. So in this case, I secured the entire crime layer. But if I wanted to take something like our service request layer, that's these little dots on the map. And if I were to look at one of these, this represents some sort of problem in the application. I think we've got some graffiti incidents and things like that. And if I look at the details of this, right now it's got a phone number and an email. What if we didn't want the anonymous user of the application to have access to that? So what I can do is take this layer, go down to the fields, and I can turn off, so anonymous users don't get access to 2 of those fields. Just going to reload. So I'll still be anonymous, and we're going to see that I won't be able to see those particular fields. Okay, so those two fields have disappeared, but if I sign in, I will have access. And we can even take these to some kind of extremes. If there's editing available on that layer, we can actually control which users are allowed to edit which fields. So it goes super deep. And there's another layer of security that's not so much about protecting the fields, but protecting the individual rows in the database itself that's driving this. So we call that record level security or feature level security. And this is implemented in a slightly different way, but basically what we hook up is something called a workflow, so that when there's a query against that layer, we can actually see who the current user is, run custom logic to decide how we should filter that layer. So I've set up a scenario here where if I sign in with a particular user in this case, but it could be secured by role, that I'm actually going to filter out everything except for the graffiti service request incidents. And in this case, I'm just going to open sign in ArcGIS Online. And I'm going to use a different ArcGIS account this time. And what this is doing is it's running that filter, and we can see that the only incidents that I can see are the graffiti incidents. So individual users, we can restrict tons about what they might want to see. There's incredible power in this, that all these different stages of what we can secure and how detailed we can get. It lets you write single applications where we've got one app that's got them all the configuration, and then we just use security and permissions to fine tune what's possible in that app. If you think about the alternatives, maybe we're creating tons of different apps to represent our different user bases, and then which user is supposed to sign into which app. There's a bit of a management nightmare there. So with these fine-grained permissions, being able to just tailor what an individual application is able to do is incredibly powerful. One thing I haven't really gotten into is what all these possible things that we can secure by are. So I'm just quickly going to show you, but each one of these sort of groups as those latitude geographics that represents my ArcGIS Online organization. We also have Windows-specific users. So what we can do is if I wanted to secure by a Windows group, so I can type in, it's just an autocomplete, but it's suggesting my AD roles. So anyone belonging to a particular Active Directory role, I can secure by that. I can secure for individual Active Directory users. I can secure by roles in my ArcGIS Online organization. So my ArcGIS Online administrators, I can also secure by specific groups, so custom groups that are available in ArcGIS Online are possible. And you also have high-level categories of just everyone that's authenticated or everyone that's authenticated from ArcGIS Online. There's loads of different categories that allow you to apply permissions. And also, since I can apply permissions from these different identity providers, we can actually mix and match these. So if most of my users are in AD or most of my users are in an ArcGIS organization, I can set up permissions for them, but I can also set up permissions for ad hoc users that I've created for contractors in identity servers. So I can mix and match all these things. So really it allows you to have one application, or at least the smallest number of applications that can apply to the broadest set of users with different permissions. So lots of power there. Okay, we're just coming up on time here. That's sort of the end of the demo section here. The last slide, just a quick summary here. So just to wrap up quickly here, really there's some takeaways here. I think we want you to know who your users are. When you're starting out on the sort of your security adventure here of setting things up, really understanding who your users are and what your organizational strategy is, because we really want to leverage that and let parts of your organization that deal with security or deal with users let them do that. And we just want to consume that information as a GIS application. And similarly, for your GIS infrastructures or your Esri infrastructure, have a strategy for ArcGIS Online Portal. Even if you're not there yet, come up with a strategy, see how that fits with your identity model so that we can use that in your GIS application. And if we can set that up, then allowing a GIS application like Geocortex Essentials to just apply that using permissions that are incredibly powerful, that's where I think you're really gonna see big wins. So you've got the whole identity model coming from your organization in ArcGIS Online, and then the GIS application that's presenting content to your end users is just applying permissions. And there's so many different permissions that you can apply and ways that you can influence your application to make it incredibly rich. So thank you so much for listening today. If you've got any questions, there's a number that have come in through the chat in the chat window. I'll be following up with those after. You can also just email me if you like. Thank you so much for listening. Have a happy Halloween.